All right, on to missing data. I'm excited to that since we moved to R, we've got a great many more uh, tools available to us to deal with missing data. I'll talk a little bit about the history of missing data analyses and then some of the modern approaches that we use. Every discussion becomes is always based on these three concepts: missing completely at random, missing at random, and missing not at random. I have to tell you, reading literature on missing data is horrible because they use these abbreviations all the time. The abbreviations are so damn close to each other. It's really hard to read that stuff. There's also a terminology quirk. Dependent variable doesn't mean what you think it means in terms of missing data. Dependent variable does not mean your actual dependent variable. It means whatever variable has missing data. Whatever variable we're talking about or we're focused on is the dependent variable. So that's a challenging term. Just remember, it's used differently. And I think the best thing that I've ever heard. This came from the Quantitude podcast. Yes, there is a podcast about statistics, and of course, I listen religiously while running or exercising. One of the hosts, Patrick Curran, in an episode on missing data, said famously, "If I could go back in time, I would punch whoever invented these terms in the face." And I'm right there with you, Patrick. All right, missing completely at random. Missing values on the dependent variable. Remember, that just means whatever variable has missing data are unrelated to each other to other variables in the data set. It's unrelated to the dependent variable itself. That is where you would have scored on that variable. Makes no difference if you would have been higher or lower. It doesn't predict missingness. This might and this would and also I'm sorry, as unrelated to the other variables in the data set as well as the first condition. This might occur if a machine wasn't administered due to a clerical error. Back when I taught it at Cal State Long Beach, they had this really old copy machine, and when I would be making exams, I learned very quickly that this machine tended to drop pages at a random fashion. So I learned very quickly to print 3 or 4 extras and to have every student check to make sure they had all the pages, so that I could actually give the exams properly. Under missing completely at random conditions, most approaches work well. However, this assumption is very difficult to meet. This is like the magical unicorn of statistics. It's hard to meet this assumption. So we'll see a variety of procedures that all have to assume MCAR, which is not a good strategy. Missing at random. Again, the terminology. Values on the dependent variable can be predictable by other data variables in the data set. One thing you might think of is, let's say we've got a depression measure and an anxiety measure. It might be that people who are highly anxious tend to end the survey before they get to the depression inventory. So anxiety predicts whether somebody would be missing or not. However, it's unrelated to the DV itself. People who are more or less depressed would be no more or likely to not have scores on the depression variable. Missing at random assumes we can accurately predict who's missing based on on other variables in the data set, based on the relationships we observe between those data sets. And for data of this nature, and we'll talk about these procedures at length, 2, multiple imputation maximum likelihood work well. These 2 procedures assume either MAR and MCAR. Again, MCAR is like a unicorn. I used to say Bigfoot, but that doesn't go over well in Humboldt County, so I had to change my terminology. Glad my daughters aren't here to hear that unicorns aren't real. Okay, missing not at random, MNAR. Missing values on the dependent variable are related to where that person would have scored on the variable. People who were depressed tended to not complete the depression measure more than people who were not. Multiple imputation and maximum likelihood are better than others, but not as good as in MAR situations. Now, one thing to keep in mind about these three situations is they only exist, you can only establish them through simulation. When we get a data set, we have absolutely no idea what we're dealing with. However, we can choose procedures that can handle the widest range of approaches. All right, some examples. Let's say I'm predicting eating disorders. I get an eating disorders risk scale. It's MCAR if scheduling difficulties perhaps led to that aspect, that instrument not being administered on a certain day. Again, that scale being administered was not related to treatment status, wasn't related to eating disorders. It was related to some other factor that was that had nothing to do with the individual. Missing at random would be cases where values on the eating disorder scales were related to the treatment, but once we accounted for the influence of treatment, the propensity to be missing on that disorder scale becomes unrelated to eating disorder risk. That is, the treatment tells us who tends to be missing, but eating disorder risk does not. And then missing not at random if people with eating disorders were more likely to fail to complete the EDR. That means the propensity for missing data is related to eating disorders. And what's interesting about this is, again, that's a highly theoretical thing, because how would we know that people who are high on this measure wouldn't complete the measure because they didn't complete the measure? Think about that one for a while.